Mira, pero ven acá, no se metan para acá, pues no sabemos qué hay ahí que se pueda equivocar.
Okay, so the unthinkable just happened. In the early hours of this morning, President Trump ordered a full-scale military operation against Venezuela, and Nicolás Maduro, the dictator who's been ruling that country with an iron fist for years, is now in U.S. custody. We're talking about American special forces conducting a raid inside a foreign capital, capturing a sitting head of state, and extracting him to face justice in the United States. This is absolutely unprecedented in modern history. This is the kind of operation that people thought only happened in movies, and it just went down in real time. The White House is calling this Operation Venezuelan Freedom. Early reports indicate that U.S. Navy SEALs, Delta Force operators, and other special operations units, supported by intelligence from the CIA and NSA, launched a coordinated strike on multiple locations in Caracas in the pre-dawn hours. The primary target was Maduro himself, along with key members of his inner circle, including his wife Cilia Flores, top military commanders, intelligence chiefs, and cabinet officials. And according to Pentagon sources, the operation was a complete success. Maduro was captured, along with dozens of regime officials, and they're now being transported to the United States to face federal charges. Now, before we get into the details of exactly how this operation went down, what the legal basis was, what this means for U.S. foreign policy and international law, and what happens next in Venezuela, let me just say this. You can't trust mainstream media to give you the full story here. They're going to focus on the spectacle, the drama, the military action, and they're going to completely miss the bigger picture about constitutional authority, about the precedent this sets for presidential power, about the massive geopolitical implications of the United States conducting a military operation to kidnap a foreign leader. That's why we built U.S. Power Alert, to cut through the noise and bring you real analysis, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to understand what's actually happening here, not just the headlines, but the deeper forces at play, make sure you subscribe to the channel right now. We bring you this kind of in-depth coverage every single day. Just hit the subscribe button below to join us. And drop a comment with your reaction to this operation, because this is history unfolding in real time, and we want to hear what you think. Are you with Trump on this, or do you think this crosses a line? Let us know. Alright, let's get back to the video. Here's what happened. According to sources in the Pentagon and intelligence community, planning for this operation has been underway for months. The Trump administration has been collecting intelligence on Maduro's movements, his security protocols, his safe houses, his travel patterns. They've been coordinating with opposition forces inside Venezuela, with Colombian intelligence, with regional allies. They've been pre-positioning military assets in the Caribbean, conducting rehearsals, gaming out every possible scenario. The operation itself kicked off around 3:30 in the morning local time in Caracas. That's when the first wave of helicopters, launched from U.S. Navy vessels offshore, crossed into Venezuelan airspace. We're talking about MH-60 Blackhawks carrying assault teams, supported by MH-47 Chinooks with backup forces and extraction capabilities, and AH-64 Apache gunships providing air cover. The force also included AC-130 gunships circling overhead with heavy firepower in case things went sideways. The primary target was a compound on the outskirts of Caracas, where intelligence indicated Maduro was spending the night. This wasn't the presidential palace, which would have been too heavily defended and too visible. This was one of several secure locations that Maduro rotated between to avoid exactly this kind of operation. But U.S. intelligence, apparently working with sources inside Maduro's security detail, knew exactly where he was. The assault teams fast-roped onto the compound, breached the perimeter, and encountered resistance from Venezuelan security forces. There was gunfire, there were explosions, but the American operators had overwhelming tactical advantage. Night vision, body armor, superior training, superior firepower. The Venezuelan guards, many of whom apparently weren't expecting an attack, were quickly overwhelmed. Some fought back, some surrendered, some fled. Within minutes, the assault teams had secured the compound and located Maduro. According to reports, he was found in a secure room with his wife Cilia Flores and several bodyguards. There was a brief standoff, but Maduro ultimately surrendered. He was flex-cuffed, hooded, and immediately evacuated to one of the waiting helicopters. The entire operation, from insertion to extraction, took less than 20 minutes. But that wasn't the only target. Simultaneously, other teams were hitting locations across Caracas. The defense minister's residence, the intelligence headquarters, a military base where regime loyalists were concentrated, safe houses where other high-value targets were believed to be hiding. We're hearing reports of at least 6 separate raids happening at the same time, all coordinated to prevent any kind of organized response from the Venezuelan military. And here's where it gets really interesting. The Trump administration apparently had intelligence that significant portions of the Venezuelan military were not going to resist. In the weeks leading up to this operation, U.S. officials had reportedly been in contact with senior Venezuelan commanders, offering them the same deal we talked about earlier. Stand down, cooperate with the transition, and you won't be prosecuted. Fight back, and you'll be treated as hostile combatants. And apparently, enough of them took the deal. So when these raids started happening, when American helicopters were flying over Caracas, when special forces were kicking in doors and arresting regime officials, the Venezuelan military largely did nothing. Some units were ordered to respond but refused. Other units were told to stand down by their commanders. A few isolated pockets put up resistance and were quickly neutralized. But there was no organized military response. No fighter jets scrambled to intercept the helicopters. No anti-aircraft batteries opened fire. No armored divisions rolled into Caracas to defend the regime. The Venezuelan military, for all intents and purposes, stood aside and let it happen. By sunrise, Maduro and approximately 30 high-ranking officials were in U.S. custody. They were transported by helicopter to a secure location, possibly a U.S. military base in Colombia or a Navy ship offshore, and from there, they're being flown to the United States. The Pentagon is saying they'll be processed through Guantanamo Bay initially for security reasons, and then transferred to federal custody to face trial. President Trump addressed the nation at 6 a.m. Eastern Time. He was in the Situation Room, surrounded by military commanders and his national security team. And he was absolutely triumphant. He said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that this operation represents the liberation of the Venezuelan people from a brutal dictatorship. He said Maduro is a narco-terrorist who's been responsible for the deaths of thousands of Venezuelans, who's been trafficking drugs into the United States, who's been harboring terrorists and criminal organizations. He said the United States has a moral obligation to stand up to tyrants and to defend freedom in the Western Hemisphere. And he said this operation sends a message to every dictator in the world that America is back, that we're not afraid to use force when necessary, and that if you threaten American interests or brutalize your own people, you will face consequences. Now, Trump also tried to provide some legal justification for this operation. He cited the authorization for use of military force that Congress passed after 9/11, which allows the president to use force against terrorist organizations. He said Maduro's regime has been designated as a narco-terrorist organization by the U.S. government, and therefore falls under that authorization. He also cited his constitutional authority as commander-in-chief to protect American national security interests. And he pointed to the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, the millions of refugees flooding into neighboring countries, including the United States, as justification for intervention. But here's the problem. The legal basis for this operation is incredibly shaky. The AUMF was designed to go after al-Qaeda and groups directly responsible for 9/11. Stretching it to cover a military operation against a sovereign government that the U.S. happens to not like is a massive expansion of presidential war powers. And the humanitarian justification, while it sounds good, doesn't really hold up under international law. You can't just invade a country because you think their government is bad. That's not how sovereignty works. So we're looking at a situation where the President of the United States just ordered a military operation on foreign soil, captured a foreign head of state, and brought him back to the U.S. to face trial, all without explicit congressional authorization, all without UN approval, all without any real legal framework beyond Trump's assertion of executive authority. And that raises huge constitutional questions. Congress is supposed to have the power to declare war. The War Powers Resolution requires the President to notify Congress within 48 hours of committing armed forces to military action, and limits how long forces can remain without congressional authorization. Did Trump follow those procedures? Did he get buy-in from congressional leadership? Or did he just decide on his own that this operation was necessary and order it to happen? We're already hearing from Democrats in Congress that they're going to launch investigations. They're talking about potential impeachment articles for abuse of power, for conducting an unauthorized war, for violating the War Powers Resolution. Republicans are defending Trump, saying this was a justified use of force against a terrorist regime, saying the president has the authority to protect American national security, saying Congress should rally around the flag rather than second-guessing a successful military operation. But even some Republicans are uncomfortable. Senator Rand Paul has already put out a statement questioning the legal basis for the operation. He's saying that while Maduro is a terrible dictator, that doesn't give the president the right to invade Venezuela without congressional approval. Other libertarian-leaning Republicans are echoing that concern. Okay, let's break down what this actually means, because this is potentially the most significant foreign policy event of Trump's presidency, maybe of the entire 21st century so far. This is the United States openly conducting regime change through military force. This is kidnapping a foreign leader and bringing him back to face American justice. This is a reassertion of American unilateral power in a way we haven't seen since the Iraq War. First, understand the precedent this sets for presidential power. If Trump can order a military operation to capture Maduro without congressional authorization, what else can he do? Can he order strikes on Iran? Can he invade Cuba? Can he go after Kim Jong-un in North Korea? Where's the line? And who gets to decide? This fundamentally changes the balance of power between the executive branch and Congress when it comes to war and foreign policy. For decades, there's been this tension about how much authority the president has to use military force without congressional approval. Different presidents have pushed those boundaries in different ways. But this is a whole new level. This is not a targeted strike against a terrorist. This is not a limited intervention to protect American citizens. This is a full-scale operation to overthrow a foreign government and kidnap its leader. If Congress doesn't push back hard on this, if they let Trump get away with it, that becomes the new normal. Future presidents will point to this as precedent for their own unilateral military actions. And we could be looking at a situation where the executive branch has essentially unlimited war-making power as long as they can come up with some national security justification. Second, this has absolutely massive implications for international law and the global order. The entire system of international relations since World War II has been based on the principle of sovereignty. Countries don't invade other countries and kidnap their leaders. There are diplomatic processes. There are international courts. There are mechanisms for dealing with rogue regimes. But you don't just send in special forces to grab a head of state because you don't like him. Now, the U.S. is going to argue that this was justified because Maduro is a criminal, a drug trafficker, a human rights abuser. And all of that is true. But the problem is, who gets to decide which leaders are legitimate and which ones can be kidnapped? What if China decides they want to grab the president of Taiwan because they consider Taiwan a rogue province? What if Russia decides to kidnap the leader of a Baltic state they have a dispute with? What if any country with a powerful military decides they can just go arrest leaders of countries they have problems with? This could fundamentally undermine the international system. And a lot of countries, even American allies, are going to be very uncomfortable with this. We're already hearing concerns from European leaders. They're saying that while they have no love for Maduro, they're worried about the precedent of unilateral military action to overthrow governments. They're worried that this makes the world more dangerous, more unpredictable. Third, let's talk about the reaction from Russia and China. Both countries have been strong supporters of Maduro. They've invested billions of dollars in Venezuela. They've sold weapons, provided military advisors, helped the regime evade sanctions, and now the United States has just gone in and taken out their ally in the most dramatic way possible. This is a massive humiliation for Moscow and Beijing. It shows that they can't protect their friends when the U.S. decides to act. And that's going to force them to respond somehow. Maybe they ramp up support for other anti-American regimes as a show of strength. Maybe they retaliate in other theaters, getting more aggressive in Ukraine or the South China Sea or Taiwan. Maybe they try to support some kind of resistance movement in Venezuela to undermine the U.S.-backed transition. There's also the question of whether this pushes Russia and China closer together. They both now have a shared interest in constraining American power, in creating alternatives to U.S. dominance. This operation could accelerate efforts to build a multipolar world order where the United States doesn't have free rein to do whatever it wants. Fourth, what does this mean for Venezuela itself? On one level, Maduro's capture is potentially great news for the Venezuelan people. He's been a brutal dictator. His regime has destroyed the economy, caused mass suffering, violated human rights on a massive scale. Getting him out of power creates the possibility for change, for reform, for democracy. But here's the problem. The United States just invaded Venezuela and kidnapped their president. Even people who hated Maduro might be upset about that. There's going to be nationalist backlash. There are going to be Venezuelans who see this as American imperialism, as a violation of their sovereignty, as humiliating. And that could complicate the transition. Plus, taking out Maduro doesn't automatically solve Venezuela's problems. The country's institutions are destroyed. The economy is in ruins. There are armed groups, militias, criminal organizations all over the place. There are deep political divisions. Rebuilding Venezuela is going to take years, probably decades, and it's going to require massive resources and sustained international commitment. And there's the question of who takes power now. The Trump administration is presumably backing the opposition, but which faction? There are different opposition groups with different agendas. Some are genuinely democratic. Others might be just as authoritarian as Maduro, but more friendly to Washington. If the US is seen as installing a puppet government, that's going to create more problems. Fifth, let's talk about the legal proceedings against Maduro. He's being brought to the United States to face charges of narco-terrorism, drug trafficking, money laundering, and potentially human rights abuses. This is going to be an absolutely massive trial. We're talking about a former head of state in the dock in a U.S. federal court. The evidence against him, the testimony, the revelations about corruption and criminality, it's all going to be explosive. But there are also legal challenges. Maduro's lawyers are going to argue that he has diplomatic immunity, that he was a sitting head of state when he was captured, that the U.S. had no jurisdiction to arrest him, that the operation itself was illegal. They're going to challenge every aspect of the prosecution. And while it's unlikely they'll win, given the overwhelming evidence against Maduro and the fact that U.S. courts generally defer to the executive branch on national security matters, it's going to be a long, complicated legal battle. There's also the question of what happens to Cilia Flores and the other captured officials. Are they all going to be tried separately? Are there going to be plea deals? Is the U.S. going to offer some of them reduced sentences in exchange for testimony against Maduro? How long are these trials going to take? Sixth, we need to talk about the impact on the 2026 midterms and domestic politics. Trump is going to campaign on this hard. He's going to say he took down a dictator, he liberated Venezuela, he showed American strength. His base is going to love it. They're going to see this as proof that Trump is a strong leader who's not afraid to use American power. But it's also going to energize his critics. Democrats are going to hammer him for conducting an unauthorized war, for violating the Constitution, for potentially getting the U.S. into another long-term military commitment in Latin America. They're going to compare this to Iraq, to Afghanistan, to all the previous interventions that turned into quagmires. And independent voters, they're going to be split. Some will admire the decisive action. Others will be worried about the precedent, about the cost, about where this leads. Trump's approval ratings could go up in the short term from the rally around the flag effect. But if things go badly in Venezuela, if there's violence, if American troops get deployed, if this turns into a mess, those numbers could tank. Seventh, what about Cuba and Nicaragua? With Maduro gone, both countries lose their main financial supporter. Venezuela has been propping them up with oil subsidies and cash. Without that, both regimes could face serious economic crises. And Trump might see this as an opportunity to push for regime change there too. There are already reports that the administration is considering tightening sanctions on Cuba and Nicaragua, ramping up support for opposition movements, maybe even conducting similar operations if the opportunity arises. So we could be looking at a broader campaign to transform Latin American politics and eliminate all the anti-American authoritarian regimes in the region. Eighth, let's talk about the military aspects of this operation. The fact that U.S. Special Forces were able to penetrate Venezuelan airspace, locate Maduro, capture him, and extract him without significant resistance is a massive demonstration of American military capability. It shows that when the U.S. decides to act, there's very little that medium-sized countries can do to stop us. But it also reveals intelligence capabilities that are now going to be scrutinized. How did the U.S. know where Maduro was? Who were the sources? Were there people inside Maduro's security detail working for the CIA? Were there electronic surveillance capabilities that allowed the U.S. to track his movements? All of that intelligence apparatus is now exposed, and adversaries are going to be studying this operation to figure out how to avoid the same fate. Now here's what we need to watch over the coming days and weeks. First, the reaction from the Venezuelan people. Are there celebrations in the streets because Maduro is gone? Or is there anger at American intervention? How organized is the opposition? Can they quickly establish a transitional government that has legitimacy? Second, the reaction from the Venezuelan military. So far they've stood down. But are there elements that might try to resist? Are there loyalist forces that might launch a counterattack or try to destabilize the transition? Or has the military completely accepted that the Maduro era is over? Third, the international response. What do Russia and China actually do? Do they just issue statements condemning the operation, or do they take concrete actions? What about European allies? Do they support the US, or do they distance themselves? What about the United Nations? Is there going to be a Security Council resolution condemning this? Fourth, the congressional response. Do Democrats follow through on threats of investigations and impeachment? Do Republicans stay united behind Trump? Are there enough GOP defectors to create problems for the administration? Fifth, the legal proceedings. When does Maduro's trial start? What charges exactly is he facing? What kind of defense does he mount? How long does this process take? Sixth, the situation on the ground in Venezuela. Is there violence? Is there chaos? Does the economy start to improve, or does it get worse? Do refugees start returning, or do more people flee? Does the international community provide the aid and support needed for reconstruction? And seventh, what happens next with Trump's foreign policy? Does he try similar operations elsewhere? Does this embolden him to take more aggressive action against Iran, North Korea, or other adversaries? Or does the backlash from this operation constrain him? So here's the bottom line. President Trump just ordered the most dramatic and controversial foreign policy operation in modern American history. He sent U.S. Special Forces into Venezuela, captured Nicolás Maduro, and is bringing him back to face trial. This is unprecedented. This is a fundamental assertion of American unilateral power. This is regime change through military force on a scale we haven't seen since Iraq. And it raises absolutely massive questions. Questions about presidential authority and constitutional limits. Questions about international law and sovereignty. Questions about American credibility and the global order. Questions about what kind of country the United States is and what kind of world we want to live in. If this operation leads to a genuine democratic transition in Venezuela, if it brings freedom and prosperity to millions of people who've suffered under dictatorship, Trump will be vindicated. This will go down as a major foreign policy success. But if it leads to chaos, violence, instability, if it triggers a broader conflict, if it damages American alliances and undermines international law, this could be remembered as a catastrophic mistake. Right now, we're in the immediate aftermath. The dust is still settling. Maduro is in custody, but everything else is up in the air. The next few weeks are going to be absolutely critical. Keep your eyes on Venezuela, on the congressional hearings, on the international reaction, on Trump's next moves. This is a hinge point in history. What happens next is going to shape American foreign policy, global politics, and the balance of power for years to come. Stay with us as this story develops. This is far from over.